Your lecturer is Dr. Thomas F.X. Noble. A noted professor of history at the University of Notre Dame, Dr. Noble brings a keen eye to the complexities of the past. Winner of Notre Dame's celebrated Edmund P. Joyce CSC Award for Excellence in Teaching, Professor Noble is co-author of the popular textbook Western Civilization, The Continuing Experiment, now in its 5th edition.
These lectures are titled Foundations of Western Civilization, Part 1.
Hello, my name is Thomas Noble. I'm the director of the Medieval Institute and professor of history at the University of Notre Dame. It's going to be my pleasure to share with you over the course of 48 lectures some of my reflections on the foundations of Western civilization. We have a lot of time to cover. We have a lot of space to cover. I often say this is going to be a bit like riding through the Louvre on a motorcycle. You're going to see a lot of things. I hope we can raise some interest. I hope we can put some things in perspective for you. I hope, in a way, that this exercise will be a bit like rummaging about in Granny's attic. You're going to find a lot of familiar things as we go along. I hope that you'll frequently have what is sometimes called the aha experience. Aha, that's where that comes from. That's why they say that. That's why they do that. That's why we talk that way. That's where that word came from. But in one way or another, we're going to go from the dawn of civilization to the dawn of the modern world. And that is a very long time. Now, you may know that for Sherlock Holmes, the first principle of detection was to begin with the obvious. Let's start by standing the old sleuth on his head, beginning with what's not so obvious. That is to say, what I'd like to do for the next little while is reflect on these words: Western civilization and foundations. In other words, basically the title for this course. What do those words mean? What does this imply? What are we going to talk about in this course? All right, let's begin with the West. The West. I think, well, what does that mean? How would we proceed to define it? We might do so culturally. We might say the West is characterized by, for instance, free and participatory political institutions. We might say that the West is characterized by capitalist economies, a form of economy that permits individuals a large measure of control over their own life, permits them to make rational choices. We might say that the West is characterized by a tradition of religious toleration, the ability to accommodate simultaneously a variety of different, sometimes diametrically opposed, religious points of view. We might say that the West is characterized by a spirit of rational inquiry. I shall apply my mind to the world around me, and I will have only those answers as are achieved by my mind in reflecting on the world around me. We may say it means an innovative spirit, a willingness to do new things, to try new things, to make new departures. Well, we could go on and on. We could talk of aesthetics and many other things, but I think you'll perhaps see the point. We could define the West as a cultural phenomenon. But we could also define it geographically. We can say that we're going to deal with a cultural tradition that began in Mesopotamia, moved into the Mediterranean basin, crossed into Western Europe, and then at the dawn of the modern world, globalized itself. So it wound up being everywhere. Now, any definition we pose is going to bring some controversy. Let me just mention a couple of examples to illustrate what I mean. The West has simultaneously had freedom and slavery. Does the West stand for freedom or for oppression? Or does the West stand for liberation from oppression? It must be said that throughout all of its history, women have enjoyed fewer opportunities, fewer possibilities than men have enjoyed. What implications does that have for how we think about the West? The West has generated enormous material wealth, but it has distributed that wealth unevenly. Some have enjoyed unimaginable richness, others unbearable poverty. We must acknowledge those realities as well. Definitions, I dare say, bring paradox. For example, Western civilization began, as we'll see in our next lecture, in what we now call Iraq, Sumer in antiquity. But I think you'd have a pretty hard time making a case that Iraq is Western. Today, Japan, in the Far East, seems more Western than parts of the West, at least on economic grounds. For example, technological grounds. Think for a moment about some of the curiosities of the Cold War era. Again, let's think of the Mediterranean world, where we will spend a lot of our time and energy in this course of lectures. During the Cold War years, Turkey, which was east, was more Western than Libya, which was west, but more Eastern. So where is the West? Quite simply, physically, geographically, where is the West? Well, you know, we'll have to try to figure that out. Again and again and again. We'll be very conscious of where are we. Okay, so West is a little messy. It's not absolutely easy to define. It's not so self-evident, obvious, as Holmes would have said, you see, what the West is. How about civilization? Is that any easier to define? Alas, no. The word comes from a Latin root, civ, civ, or qui. We see this, for instance, in Latin words like civis, which means citizen, civitas, which means city, civilis, which means civil, yes, but it means polite, yes, but it means to behave like a person from a city, to behave like a citizen. A citizen is a person from a city. These very words sneak something into our consciousness about what civilization is, or it must be. It must have cities. It must have cities. Our words tell us that. Now, Greek vocabulary is much the same. The Greek for city is a polis. And that gives us our words like political and politics. The Greek word politeia means a constitution. So we have, again, a sense that there is a whole vocabulary and a whole culture lurking behind it, rooted in the idea of cities. So to get civilization, to begin to form any kind of an understanding of civilization, we've got to make cities. Okay, how do we do that? How do we do that? How do we make cities? How do we make cities happen historically? Cities emerged, it is now pretty generally thought, as a result of, as a consequence of, after a process which we call the Neolithic Revolution. The Neolithic Revolution. Now, this is a revolution which began probably something on the order of 9,000 or 10,000 years ago. Okay? At the end of its process, perhaps something like 5,000 years ago, the Neolithic Revolution had generated cities, and more than that, probably what we would call civilization, in both Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, and in Egypt. Now, in our next lectures, we'll look in more detail at what actually happened in the historical period in Mesopotamia and Egypt. For the moment, what we want to say is, what was this Neolithic Revolution, this rather leisurely revolution that took perhaps 5 millennia to work itself out? Its effects and consequences were revolutionary. There's no doubt about that. But it did move along at a rather genteel pace. Fundamentally, we can put names on the things that happened during this revolution. Agriculture and the domestication of animals. Agriculture and the domestication of animals. Now, Neolithic is Greek. It means new stone. Neos lithos, the new stone age. If we were to think in images, if we were to think in metaphors about the Neolithic period, It would mean the period when people began for the first time to fashion tools and weapons that permitted them to exert some control over the world around them rather than being controlled by it. Let's not exaggerate. Anyone who has lived through a great natural disaster, a hurricane, an earthquake, a tornado, knows perfectly well that even now, and with all our vast technology, we cannot control nature. But we're talking about a time, 10,000 or thereabouts years ago, when people began for the first time to exercise some control over the world around them. But moving away from images and symbols and metaphors, we can say that in agriculture and the domestication of animals, we see some real changes in the kinds of things that groups of human beings did. So this is a very long process, this Neolithic revolution. We can think about it in concrete terms or in symbolic terms, but however we think of it, and however long it took, it produced cities and then civilization. Extracting food from arid regions lies behind the story we must tell. Civilization arose in river valleys, as far as we know. It arose in the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley in Mesopotamia. It arose in the Nile River Valley in Egypt. It arose in the Indus River Valley in India. It arose in the Yangtze River Valley in China. It arose in the Congo in Africa. In some of these places, the climate was very different from that. For example, in Africa, where you have an equatorial, humid, hot climate, it was not quite like the desert climate of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Egypt and Mesopotamia, more like, for example, the Indus than like the Congo, but there are differences here as well. We're going to focus on Mesopotamia and then on Egypt. Hot, dry, arid climates from which we wish to extract life, from which we wish to extract food. This is going to be a significant problem of human organization. It's going to require social cohesion. It's going to require cooperation. As near as we can tell, the great motor process is irrigation. I have a river. I have water in the river. I have land. The land is dry. I want that water out on that dry land. How am I going to do that? Now, once I begin to develop an intricate system of dikes and channels and dams and pumps, I have something that is going to root me where I have built all that. This is not portable. You don't build something like this and then move on. You build something like this, and then you settle where you built it, and more and more and more people settle. And this permits you, for example, as you water this land along the course of a river, to grow more food, to grow more kinds of food, to grow food more predictably, and to feed a population more stably than had ever been the case before. But as you do this, as you begin to concentrate populations and to produce predictable, replicable food supplies, you begin to confront certain very interesting problems of social, and then beyond that, of political organization. You know, in biblical language, we think that there must be hewers of stone and drawers of water. There must be people who do different things. Who decides? Is this done by social class? Is this done by some other mark of privilege? Is this done by aptitude? It's very hard to say at the very earliest moments how you make these distinctions, how you draw these differentiations. But the fact is that there will be people in society, for instance, who will tend the fields, perhaps other people who will tend the flocks, perhaps other people who will work on the irrigation systems. And then eventually there will be craftspeople, and there will also be persons charged with religious responsibilities, perhaps others charged with governing responsibilities. As the system goes, it'll get more and more and more complicated. But we're at the emergence of the specialization of labor. And the specialization of labor puts us at the front edge of political differentiation. Now, at one level, of course, we can say that this is all relatively simple. It is societies providing for themselves their most basic and fundamental needs, food, in one way or another. If we control the fields and we grow our food, we are not responsible as foragers for finding whatever happens to be available. If we tend our crops and, our flocks, and we raise our flocks, we can, for instance, from a sheep, we can get a renewable source of material to make clothing. We can get, for example, from cows, dairy products. Of course, if I want a steak, I have to kill the cow. But we can get also reliable food supplies. We may find that we can get beasts of burden. These animals can carry things for us. But in one way or another, we are managing these animals and managing the kinds of things that they can provide for us. But then we can take a step or two beyond that. Arts and crafts will emerge as a way for us to differentiate ourselves. We may wear slightly different jewelry, for example, from the person next door. We may adorn our homes with slightly different products, objects of beauty, of interest from the people next door. We may adorn our towns. We may adorn our temples. We may adorn our palaces with the products of human invention and human skill and put them around us. And the arts and the crafts, as we know them, will begin to emerge. Finally, we get writing. One of the great early achievements. Now, we'll talk much about writing and forms of writing and why we have writing at all and why we have writing in the forms in which we have it in later lectures. Right now, I simply want to signal that with the emergence of writing, we see one of the remarkable achievements of this Neolithic revolution, one of the remarkable achievements of the emergence of civilization, and we cross a threshold into the historical period. For now, we begin to have durable forms of evidence. Durable forms of evidence that permit us, in the present, to eavesdrop on the doings and the thinkings of people long ago. We get to watch them telling us concretely what they did, and we get to watch them trying to manage how we will think about them. And thus history, as a dual process of discovering what happened and of reflecting on all of the different reflections on what happened, is born almost simultaneously. Now, these key elements seem to mark virtually all civilizations. This basic process, something like this Neolithic revolution, something like the emergence of cities, agriculture, the domestication of animals, and so on. Our job here is going to be to talk about Western civilization. This is not to imply that there are no other civilizations. That would be absurd. We could speak, for example, of African civilization. We could talk of Chinese civilization. On somewhat smaller scales, we might talk of Maya civilization or Aztec civilization. It will be my contention in discussing with you some of these foundations of Western civilization over this course of lectures, that the West is unique, that the West is distinctive, that there are things about the West that make it different. But you won't hear me leading cheers. I am not here to praise. I am here to explain. Our task is to understand. That, it seems to me, is crucial. Now, civilization arose perhaps 5,000 years ago. Perhaps 5,000 years ago. For just a moment, let's build a little perspective. The Earth is perhaps 4 billion years old. Homo sapiens sapiens, people like us, perhaps 40,000 years old. Our basic human ancestors, perhaps 100,000 years old. Our remotest ancestors in East Africa, perhaps 1 million years old. That already puts that civilized period into some perspective, doesn't it? Let's imagine 4 billion years as a calendar of a single year. So everything begins on January 1st. If we want to be concerned with, we want to study the civilized period, which is not surprising. We're humans, we're interested in ourselves. We're interested in the civilized period. It's a few minutes before midnight on December 31st. in our imaginary calendar. I think that perspective is humbling. I think that perspective is humbling. Nevertheless, however humbled we may be, we're going to plunge forward and talk about that civilized period, at least in the West. Okay, so West is a little messy. Civilization, a little less messy, but still fairly complicated as a proposition. What about foundations? Surely that word seems easy. Well, maybe not. For example, if we're going to talk about foundations, are we interested in the first place in origins? Well, of course we are. But only in origins? Are we only interested in how everything started? And we have no interest in its life, its vitality, its vigor, its span over time? Everything grows, everything changes, everything evolves. Nothing stays the same. So origins will certainly figure in our story, but foundations cannot be equated with origins. Foundations got to be bigger than that. Well, we might say durability is important. Sure it is, absolutely. Durability is important. Some things really have staying power. They've been around a long time. We've studied them a long time. They have influenced us for a long time. But durability is tricky. I mean, if we poke at this, for example, from a couple of different angles, we could say the oldest continuously functioning institution in the world is the papacy, the head of the Roman Catholic Church. But about 20% of the world's population is Catholic. The Athenian polis lasted in its highest manifestation less than a century, its golden age barely more than a generation. But it has fired imaginations for 2,500 years. Rome's greatest legacy, perhaps, was her law, the most influential, certainly, legal system that the world ever created. And yet relatively few people today live, strictly speaking, under Roman law. So what does durable mean? How exactly do we understand this phenomenon of durability? Foundations may seem somehow to us to be connected to revivals. In other words, something was there at the start, was the foundation, and then we revive it periodically. Well, think of Greek or classical revival architecture. At the dawn of the United States, Greek and Roman revival architecture was very prominent. And why was it prominent? Well, perhaps those people liked it. But more importantly, it made a powerful ideological statement. It was an attempt to attach this new nation to an older history, to an ancient world, to a great tradition, to say, we are not something brand new. We are the best. We are the best manifestation now of what is richest in the old. Think of postmodern architecture. Very often, we take modernist geometry run amok, pure form and all that, and we put classical details on it, simply to echo an earlier time, an earlier way of thinking. The West has a couple of great movements, the Renaissance, for example, that are fundamentally about reviving the past, taking us back to the past, going back to our roots. Well, exactly what the Renaissance is, we will have occasion to discuss in several lectures later in the course. In the 16th century, the great religious reformers, the Protestant reformers, thought they were recapturing primitive Christianity, not creating something new. Martin Luther didn't say, oh, I have a new idea. He said something has been lost, tragically lost. Let us recapture it. Foundations may seem to us somehow related to traditions, but these can be invented and they can be discarded. Tradition is a very complicated matter. Let me give you a couple of perhaps rather amusing examples. Think of those ancient Scottish tartans. How many people have been tempted to buy this or that or the other tartan because it belongs to the ancient clan this or clan that or clan something else? Those things are almost all invented in the 18th century by people surrounding the culture of the great poet Rabbi Burns. Now, Robert Burns and his contemporaries are writing after the Act of Union attached Scotland to Great Britain, and people in Scotland were saying, let us make a separate past for ourselves as a way of thinking about a different future. I passed a restaurant the other day with a sign hanging on it that said, a tradition since 1979. Well, I don't know about you. That doesn't quite measure up to my sense of tradition, but I dare say we know what the person who hung that sign was trying to do. Well, in the next 47 lectures, we're going to proceed through 4,500 years We'll begin in the ancient Near East, and we'll end with a Western world that is beginning to globalize. What themes will we follow? What questions will we ask? What subjects will engage our attention again and again? Not necessarily in every single lecture, but often. Without being clumsy determinists, we're going to talk about ecology, geography, and climate. Where people lived and what the natural world around them was like is important. Not perhaps determinative, but important. We'll talk about both the visible structures and the invisible ideologies that supported them. What did governments look like, societies look like, economies look like, and how did people describe them? What did people think they were doing? And we'll compare one time to another, one phenomenon with another. We'll discuss the pagan religious beliefs of people in Mesopotamia and Egypt, to a degree of Greece and Rome as well, but essentially our focus will rest on the great Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These have been formative in the West. We'll ask from time to time, how did people live? How did they earn their livings? What were their manners? What were their customs like? What were their houses like? What were their families like? What did they do with whatever spare time they had? What did they imagine as leisure activity? We'll explore certain key philosophical ideas. Now, we'll try to say something about these philosophical ideas on their own terms and for their own right, so that as we move along, we have a little bit of understanding of what Plato thought, or what a Stoic thought, or what St. Thomas Aquinas thought. But also, and fundamentally, we'll be asking, why did those people think those kinds of things in those places and at that time? Our approach will be that of history. So too, for instance, we'll discuss a number of great works of literature, and the ideas which they expressed, and the forms in which they were presented. In other words, we will appropriately consider them as great works of art. But we're also going to look, and fundamentally we're going to look, at these works of literature as things that tell us two things above all else. More things besides, but two things essentially. When they were made, for whom were they made? Why were they made? Why were they made at a certain time and place? And what can we learn about that time and place from these works? And then, second, who have been the audiences for those works from the time they were produced down to today? Why do they matter? We'll talk about art and architecture, the most visible and public manifestations of the Western tradition. But alongside these concrete issues, we're also going to try to tease out perspectives on certain sort of slightly more thematic, certain more fundamental issues. For instance, we'll try to tease out an understanding of the difference between celebrity and distinction. Think today of how we talk about the currently hot rock stars or athletes or what have you. And ask yourself, how many of these people will, in a decade, still be interesting or important? How many of these people will be in your grandchildren's school books? How many of these people will, in 500 years, be distinguished as opposed to merely famous? We'll explore a little bit, for example, the distinction between values and virtues, between those things that seem somehow irredeemably and always and for everybody true, and the values which are, in a way, the social compacts made at any time, made in any place, and changeable. I can change my values as often as I change my hairdo. Well, perhaps I can't. I haven't got much hair anymore. But if I did, I could change my hairdo quite often. Can I change virtues so often? Can I change virtues so often? What have people thought about that problem? We'll try to understand an issue, as the Greeks put it, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Aesthetics. We'll try to understand the complementary and competing roles of faith and reason, what I believe because it has been revealed to me or told to me, and what I know because I have discovered it. We'll try to explore the competing claims of the individual and the community. What rights have I against those with whom I live? What rights have they against me? So these are some of the basic themes and issues that we'll pursue again and again. They won't all come up in every lecture, but every one of them will come up again and again. We're going to end our course around 1600 AD, when many of the major features of the modern world have come into view, and the essential traditions of the Western tradition have anchored themselves. They have attained a certain kind of maturity. In the first place, two great backward-looking movements, the Renaissance and the Reformation, anchored the past into the present and made the past the way through the present into the future forever for the Western world. These kinds of revivals had happened before, but now it is made an operative dynamic of how we think. Christendom, a uniform Christian society, never fully achieved, but for a millennium an ideal, had by 1600 been permanently riven into Protestant and Catholic communities and cultures with their very different ways of thinking about the world. A set of interlocking power relationships between great nations was in place in 1600, and the diplomatic and in many ways the military history of the modern world, from about 1600 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, left that great state system in place. By 1600, it's there. And finally, the scientific revolution, emerging in the 16th century, triumphant and regnant in some ways in the 17th, had begun to alter the ancient balance between what people had long called science and what people had long called wisdom. New modes of authority, new places to look for truth, had supplanted long-standing and traditional ways of finding authority and finding truth. Those, then, are the themes, the issues, and the problems that we'll explore in looking at the foundations of Western civilization. To begin building our foundations, we turn next time to Mesopotamia.